I want to welcome everyone in my continuing series on the Lotus Sutra. Today, I'm going to be talking about the 9th chapter. And there's really too much that has transpired for me to make a summary and still give a talk. I will get into some essentials about the sutra, of course, which will help us understand this chapter. But first, I want to talk about some of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing it. And it's a really interesting exercise when you try to really confront the Dharma and you want to expound it and share it with people. So I found myself getting into an imaginary dialogue with the Lotus Sutra. And in this dialogue, the Lotus Sutra said to me, and of course this is my imagination, you're not where you're supposed to be. And then I replied, well, where am I supposed to be? And the sutra said, exactly where you are. And then I said, that doesn't make any sense. And the sutra said, exactly. You have to think about where do you think you are? How do you think you are? Why do you think you are? Who do you think you are? So we're just where we're supposed to be. It's a question of looking deeper and seeing what is keeping us from actually being where we are, what's going on in our minds, right? And the Lotus Sutra gives this grand, expansive teaching. It's a sutra that's 80,000 characters long. It seems to have been constructed over several hundred years. And it's something that hasn't necessarily been that much studied from a Zen perspective, although Shi wrote a wonderful book about it, all in Chinese. And it's kind of a challenge for our Chan practice, because in Chan, we're often looking at just this. We're not getting caught up in concepts, in views. We're experiencing the moment as the moment arises. And this is really, I believe, what the teaching of the Lotus Sutra is. It's just doing it in an exceedingly expansive way. So in order to explain that, I have to give the three main teachings that happen in the first part of the sutra, which help explain everything that comes afterwards and is connected to everything. So the sutra opens with the Buddha sitting in what's called the samadhi of innumerable meanings. And he's surrounded by all the great bodhisattvas, great arhats, and a variety of human and non-human creatures. And when he's sitting there, he emits this light from his urna right here in the middle of his forehead, and it illuminates the entire universe. I mean, in the sutra it says 18,000 worlds, but I believe that it really means the entire universe, so that everybody can see everybody else. But at that time, nobody understands what is happening. So Manjushri explains to Maitreya, Manjushri, right, and Maitreya, the great arhats, that he's seen this before, and what it is the announcement of the teaching of the Lotus Sutra itself and of the great vehicle. And here we are, we're told about this great vehicle, and it seems to encompass all of the earlier teachings, but it also supersedes them. And throughout the sutra, it's never really defined what the great vehicle is, ekayana, the one vehicle. And I believe, in a Chan sense, the reason it's never defined, it can't be defined, it would be like defining mind itself. There's nothing outside of it. And the one vehicle, the great vehicle, represents the great inclusivity of the Buddha and all sentient beings. And that this teaching is thrust through the whole sutra. But then the interesting issue is that it's so enormously wonderful and both simple and complex and literally beyond conceptuality, right? And this is another important feature of these teachings, that it is just utterly beyond concepts. It can't really be described. Because of that, the Buddha explains that he has to impart this teaching using expedient means. And expedient means is, I liken it as the great vehicle is like wisdom, and expedient means is like compassion, or it's like wisdom and function. The only way that the Buddha can impart his teachings is to understand the minds of sentient beings and speak to them on whatever level they are, in whatever way they can understand it. So, and then the third great proclamation of the Lotus Sutra is that all sentient beings have Buddha nature, and indeed will be are destined to become Buddhas. Now, just this sutra does not actually use the word Buddha nature, but it's very common to associate that with the sutra, and I believe it's quite warranted. There are words in the sutra like Dharma nature and Buddha seeds, all of which really point to this this eternal truth about who we are. So that's kind of the scenario, the atmosphere that we're given as the sutra progresses. And this, let me say a little bit about the expedient means. Now, expedient means has a kind of mundane interpretation. Any of us can use expedient means in a certain way. It's like giving a child a piece of candy so that they'll do a task that they don't want to do. It's like telling an elderly person some bad news in such a way that they're not crushed by the information. Now, the Buddha's use of expedient means is, much deeper, more subtle than that. But it's a little bit like the Emily Dickinson poem I've used in past lectures, where it says, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies." So that's it. So the truth has to be told, but it's coming in at us at an angle. And that's something really to keep in mind. The other thing, almost harking back to how I began the talk with my dialogue with the Lotus Sutra, is dealing with things that are hard to understand. And Robert Thurman has this phrase called tolerance of inconceivability. And this, at the root of this, or the reason that he's talking about it, is our faith, because there are things that we really can't understand, or we may be misunderstanding things. It's sort of hard to tell as we're on the path. But with this tolerance of inconceivability, it's not blind faith. We're not just simply mouthing words and believing it, right? Because the Buddha said, ehi passio in Pali, come and see. That's what the practice is about, experiencing for yourself. But we recognize that there are things really beyond us, but we can still embrace the underlying teaching. And that's really helpful, because a lot of people have problems with the Lotus Sutra. It has these enormous numbers in terms of length and distance, and all sorts of different creatures in it, and beings from other worlds, and different kinds of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. It's really, really massive. And then there are seeming contradictions in it. And of course, scholars have looked at it, and they note that the way it's constructed and say certain parts come before others. But I'm looking at it as a practitioner and really embracing the whole thing, and letting us look at it so we can really learn as best we can and really use it for our own practice. So it's not meant to be an academic exercise. It's really an exercise of turning the light around, of introspection in trying to understand the sutra. So let's talk about this chapter. Now, this is chapter 9, and there was a great scholar named Leon Hurwitz who in the 70s made a very accurate and scholarly translation of the Lotus Sutra, and it's still read and respected today. In the introduction to it, he gives summaries of all 28 chapters. When it comes to the 9th chapter, what we're talking about, he has 2 words: more prophecies, and that's it. That's all he says in summary. Now, as I'm going to show, there's a lot more in the 9th chapter than more prophecies, but you know, we have to look into it more deeply. And in order to make this happen, or to make it easier to understand, I'm comparing this 9th chapter with a very famous sutta from the Pali Canon called the Kalama Sutta. And I'm going to be going back and forth between these two. And when I was doing this, I felt a little bit like I was writing a plot, like for Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. You know, the action over here with Gandalf and Frodo or Luke Skywalker. So I'm going to be kind of juggling between these 2 suttas for a very good reason, and I'll explain what really unites them. And additionally, I think even according to the logic, if you will, the understanding of the Lotus Sutra, all the previous sutras in the Buddhist canon really fit into the Lotus Sutra. There's really no contradiction, and that is something that the Lotus, it says many different things, but it does say that. So in chapter 4, the Arhats who have been following the earlier teachings say the Buddha was always using the great vehicle to teach us, even though it came in the form of these early teachings. And I think other thing to get out of the way is when we talk about the great vehicle and its inclusiveness, what it is including or superseding, depending on your point of view, are the early teachings, which are the Shravakas, the sound hearers, the voice hearers, the people who followed the Buddha when he first became the Buddha and his earliest teachings. Then there are Pratyeka Buddhas, solitary Buddhas. These are kind of elusive beings. I never met one myself, who managed to achieve enlightenment on their own without a Buddha. Although the Buddha does say that he kind of provides the means for this in the Lotus Sutra in some places. So it's very interesting. And then the last of the 3 vehicles are bodhisattvas. Now, you wouldn't think that the great vehicle would supersede bodhisattvas, because a bodhisattva is someone who's taken a vow to save all sentient beings as well as him or herself. But I think in the non-dualistic idea, it's like a contradiction in terms, the way that the one vehicle can be understood and experienced is it's beyond any kind of classification. So even a classification like that of bodhisattva is going to be some sort of attachment in the mind. And many people may know of this Zen phrase about, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. And that just means look out for what kind of concepts that you are attaching to. So with that introduction, let me first talk about the ninth chapter. So in this chapter, it's really about just a few things, just like Hurwitz said, but there are subtle details. But the main thrust of it is that Ananda, the Buddha's faithful companion, the one who's like a walking data bank, who's just absorbed all of the Buddha's teachings, he is getting his prophecy of Buddhahood. And Rahula, who was the Buddha's own flesh and blood son, he also is getting a prophecy of Buddhahood. And, you know, if you read the chapter, I'm not going to go into these kind of details, this talk, but because anyone can read them, there are all these details about their particular Buddha land, the length of their kalpa or eon, you know, how long their reign, so to speak, is, the name of their land, some of the physical aspects of it, and also how long their teaching will last after their extinction. You know, when they leave the world, and which is one thing that's kind of hard to understand exactly where a Buddha might go, but that's what's in the suttas. And after they leave the world, there is their true Dharma, which lasts for a certain amount of time. And then there's what's called their merely formal or counterfeit Dharma, which is where the Dharma is still there, but it's somehow gotten watered down. It's not adhered to, and people start losing their affinity for it. So that's what's explained in the beginning of the chapter. And it's also explained that they just don't get this prophecy, and we'll be talking about that word. They still have to make offerings and follow millions and billions and trillions of Buddhas. Those are the kind of numbers that the sutra uses, and they have to save, and they will be saving countless sentient beings. Also in this sutra, a kind of subplot, if you will, there are 2,000 Shravakas, followers of the early teachings, who are getting a prophecy of Buddhahood. And interestingly enough, the length of their eon or kalpa is only one, whereas for both Ananda and Rahula, the length of time is incalculable. It pretty much sounds like forever, but evidently there's some limit to it. The other thing that happens in the chapter, which is also quite interesting, is that there are also 8,000 bodhisattvas who, when they hear that these Shravakas, the ones who are following the lesser vehicle, you know, the losers, they're getting their prophecy of Buddhism. And I don't know if they're saying to themselves, what am I, chopped liver? Why not? But they're questioning the Buddha. And the Buddha gives a very good explanation, especially with Ananda and Rahula, of why they got it, because Ananda has studied with the Buddha from time immemorial, and he took the path of study, whereas the Buddha took the path of pure practice. And Ananda was instrumental, and still is instrumental, in spreading his teachings. And of course, Rahula is his own son. But there's also this interesting dynamic message in the chapter of, yes, you really have to work at what you're doing. You have to work hard, but nonetheless, everyone gets this prophecy of Buddhahood. So that's, like I said in the beginning, it's like you're not where you're supposed to be. Well, where are you supposed to be? Exactly where you are. So it's a question of recognizing this and pulling away from and letting go of our attachments and our views and our greed, hatred, and ignorance. All of those things are operative and are shown in the chapter. One other thing, if anyone happens to be counting, at this time in the 9th chapter, 2,510 sentient beings have been given a prophecy. And this is the last time this happens in the sutra. And in the sutra, only 10 of them, of course, including Ananda and Rahula in this chapter, have been named. And this is a turning point in the sutra in that the rest of the sutra, starting kind of in chapter 10, but certainly in later chapters, really are about Buddhas themselves, more about sentient beings. So this chapter is a very important turning point. So now, as I said, I was going to compare the two suttas, and I'm going to slowly introduce the Kalama Sutra, but I'm going to do that by talking about the title of the 9th chapter. The 9th chapter, which is assurances for arhats that are studied and who haven't studied. In Chinese, it's Shou Shui Wu Shui Ren Ji. And the key word in Chinese is Shouji, which is kind of awarding a recording, literally, but it really means, or it can be taken as prophecy, and it's often translated that way. Now, interestingly enough, Leon Hurwitz translated it as prophecy. Remember I said more prophecies? But Gene Reeves, who has a much more recent translation, which is also very good, not quite as scholarly in certain ways, but he translates that shoji as assurances. And this is really very, very interesting, right? So first of all, just to talk about the word prophecy. So when we hear that, when we Westerners hear it, we often think about biblical prophecy. So the Bible is filled with prophets, right? And Buddhism is a non-profit enterprise. Anyway, so but the idea is in the Abrahamic tradition, when God says something, makes a prophecy, he makes it happen. I mean, that's why if you are a believer in that, it means it will be engineered by an external force, by God. But in the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha is not making anything happen for anyone, really. What's happening is people start to recognize where they are. They recognize their inherent Buddha nature, and ultimately recognize their Buddhahood. And so the Buddha doesn't make anything happen. He's not giving anything to Ananda or Rahula. He's not making anything happening. So what he has is foresight, and assurance is a word which means to say that if you have doubt, well, I'm here to tell you that your doubt is unwarranted. Not because of anything that the Buddha is going to do, but because of who you really are, or what's really going on with you, your true nature, your being in and of itself. So that kind of assurance is something that actually speaks to a lot of us, and this is where I think my talk would start to go to something that's really very important to all of us, is because we're really talking about suffering in Buddhism, and in this particular case, uncertainty. It's like a corollary of dukkha, of suffering, the doubts that we have. We don't know what's going to happen in any given moment. We don't know what will befall us, good or bad. And we would like something to shore us up, something so that we are not in a continual state of fear. So interestingly enough, in the beginning of the 9th chapter, both Ananda and Rahula approach the Buddha, and they've been hearing all of these prophecies, and they say, "Hello, we'd like a prophecy too. We want our share." That's literally, it almost makes me think of Hamilton's, I don't want to miss my shot. And they explain, of course, how hard they practice, how they are known by all the beings in the world, and they say that the assurance, and this is often said earlier in the sutra, it would be like being bathed in nectar to hear this. That assurance is not just for them, right? Because this is a Mahayana sutra. When they get their prophecy or their assurance of Buddhahood, this will be for the benefit of all sentient beings. But just to show, so it's very interesting how this is engineered into the sutra, even though these are arguably the greatest Shravaka practitioners ever, Ananda and Rahul. Nonetheless, they're showing some uncertainty, right? And remember, sutras are not historical documents. They're not journals. They're not textbooks. They are a living evidence of expedient means of speaking to us on a level that we can understand at various times. Our experience, our practice, as we persevere, grows deeper and deeper. So I find that sort of comforting that they're still asking for assurance. Now, so that I talked about the shoji, this which can be understood as prophecy, and there's a Sanskrit word vyakhana, which is one of the many devices that the Buddha uses, and there are this even precedes the Tripitaka, the collection of all the Buddha's teachings, that there were 9 or 12, depending on how you look at it, kind of, for lack of a better word, literary modes, rhetorical devices, vehicles that would convey the Buddha's teachings. And remember, a vehicle is something that takes you from here to there. And that's what the great vehicle is, bringing us to where we are ultimately. So so that's a good introduction to this other sutra that I want to bring in, which is called the teaching at Kesaputta, or it's popularly known as the Kalama Sutta. And the connection is this word assurance. So towards the end of this sutra, we're going to see that word come up. Now, in Pali, it's asanas. It's called the Kataro Asanas, the 4 assurances. And when I go through this, you'll see what the Kalamas needed assurance about. So I pretty much covered what's happened in the 9th chapter. So now we're moving to this next sutta. So the Kalamas were a people who lived in the town of Kesaputta, which lay on the edge of a desert. And as with many suttas, you have to construct a backstory, which in this case seems pretty clear. The Kalamas have a problem, a question. And the commentaries surmise that the problem that they had to do with death and rebirth, the ultimate course of life, one could say. And this is something, of course, I think that could speak to almost anyone. You know, what's going to happen to us? Where are we going? I mean, why am I here? All of these things, this is on the Kalama's minds. And but what's been happening, you know, before the sutta began, was any number of mendicants and would-be sages and teachers and maybe charlatans. They came barging into the town with their particular views and advice that they claim is the truth. Each new pundit criticizes his predecessor. And as the sutras say, they curse, revile, despise, and emasculate the teachings of the others. Doesn't this sound like contemporary American politics? You know, so there it is, 2,500 years ago. So the Kalamas are in a, what are they supposed to do? They don't know who to believe. So, but they've heard of the Buddha and they've heard of his reputation as a perfectly awakened one, and they seek him out and explain their quandary to him. And when the Buddha comes to town, and this is something I just love, the kind of cinematic way that some sutras are written. Some people greet him, some people don't, some people sort of remain in the corner in silence. So you can kind of intuit what's going on in their minds. Some are like really very excited, and some are thinking, who is this guy? And this is life, you know, people, this is how people react to a teacher coming in. So the first thing that the Buddha says to them is, Kalamas, it's understandable that you are uncertain. It's understandable that you are perplexed, right? Because the Buddha is a great psychologist. You know, no psychologist says to his patient, you feel that way, you're an idiot, right? You don't do that. You're on the side of the patient, of the sufferer. So the Buddha really, really feels for the Kalamas, understands where they're coming from. And then he gives, this is very famous, these 10 criteria to consider in evaluating a doctrine or a claim. And this is applicable to almost anything in a way. So I'm going to read these and discuss them in a little bit. So the Buddha says to the Kalamas, you should not be convinced by unconfirmed reports, by tradition, by hearsay, by scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reflection on superficial appearances, by delighting in opinions and speculations, by the appearance of plausibility, or because you think this person is our teacher. So these warnings, as I'm calling them, these heads up, are divided into 3 categories. Established scriptural authority, reasoning, and charismatic or eloquent presentation or teachers. So the idea is you're not getting seduced by some fantasy or something you imagine about a teaching, something you've been dreaming about. And this seems really relevant today with our warring media and fake news. So if you can't rely on these tried and true methods, remember it says, it talked about scripture, about hearsay, about thinking and pondering about things, and relying on teachers. And what else do we have? So the Buddha answers the question. He says, Kalamas, when you know for yourselves, these teachings are detrimental, these teachings are faulty, these teachings would be censured by the wise. These teachings, when fully taken up, lead to harm, to trouble. Then, Kalamas, you should reject those teachings. And one thing just to point out, which is really very interesting about this sutta. First of all, he's not speaking to Buddhists. These are not his disciples yet. These are just people who knows what their religious, spiritual tradition is, their beliefs. They just have a problem, right? And in this sutta, the Buddha is not talking really about his teachings, although that's somewhat debatable, and I'll introduce that in a moment. But he's not talking about the Four Noble Truths. He's not talking about dependent origination. He's not talking about impermanence or non-self. And he's not asking the Kalamas to become his disciples. He's not saying, hey, you're in doubt, come over to me, small down payment, and I'll give you an assurance. Nothing like that. What he's talking about is raw experience, how something actually sits with you, what your encounter with it is like. And this is when you really take up something wholeheartedly. You don't get distracted and you follow through. So in this particular case, if the teachings are not wholesome, then they will be harmful and they should be abandoned. So the Buddha then pursues this logic about the teachings that should be rejected. Remember, you'll see he's going to talk about teachings that might be embraced, but here he's starting with the negative. So he gets the Kalamas to acknowledge the implications of bad behavior, which will engender greed, hatred, and ignorance, or infatuation, hostility, and delusion. Many, many ways to say this. So these three poisons cause one to break all the concepts. That is to rend the moral fabric which keeps society together. And those actions and what the precepts are talking about are killing, stealing, lying, and sexual misconduct. Here in this particular sutta, he doesn't talk about taking intoxicants, but he does remind the Kalamas that if they act badly, they'll probably influence other people to break precepts as well. So, he's pointing out this domino effect. Causes and conditions never fail. And then the Buddha concludes that this kind of behavior, breaking precepts, these kind of actions, is harmful, blamable, and disapproved by the wise. And the Kalamas sign off on that conclusion. They agree. Now, once again, in the 9th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, these bodhisattvas don't have to be convinced about something like that. But there is something that kind of shows how doubt can be vast, can be overpowering, and can be very, very subtle. Continuing on with the way that the Buddha is discussing this with the Kalamas, he gets to the point where he tells them that if you act in this way, where in a way that is wholesome, right, and he goes through this whole formula again, all of those 10 things to look out for. But in this case, if after dispensing with all of the scriptures and all of the hearsay and the talk and what you pondered about, and your infatuation or interest in a particular teacher, when you've cut through that, and then you really experience things, and you are in a state of non-greed, non-hatred, non-ignorance, when you're in that state, then what's happened is that you are unbound, right? What you start to embrace, personify, are the 4 Brahma Viharas. In other words, you are in a state of perfect loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And I would argue that the four Brahma Viharas are kind of a proto Buddha nature. I mean, there's not much left. I mean, of course, Ananda and Rahula, I'm sure, have it. So there are very subtle differences. But so what the Buddha has done is, once again, this is expedient means. And one interesting way of understanding expedient means is as a bait and switch. Some of you, many of you may be familiar with that term. It's kind of false advertising, or it's luring somebody with one thing when you're actually delivering something else. You offer somebody a $15 membership in Netflix, and then you send them a bill for $1,000. That's a bait and switch. And there are so many different examples of it. Now, when the Buddha does a bait and switch, what he's, and using my metaphor, what he's stealing from you is your suffering, your attachments, your greed, your hatred, and your ignorance. And what he's delivering are the three jewels, the, salvation, liberation. But, once again, it's expedient means. So at first, when I read the Kalama Sutta, I just looked at it as, this is just pure objectivity. And I actually, before my daughter started college, I had her memorize that formula of, do not, listen to scriptural traditions and hearsay, etc. Because I thought, if she's embarking off to college, I want her to have an open mind and, not be prejudiced in what she's encountering. But reading the Kalama Sutta number of times, I started to see that there's this underlying thing that creeps into this sutta, is that the Buddha is sort of having the Kalamas look at what they might be holding on to, especially if it's negative, and just noting that that's an artificial thing, really. Our attachments are artificial, and letting go of them, and then opening your eyes, realistically and metaphorically. Well, what do you find? You find Buddha Dharma. So it's been there all along. So I sort of see it as really a very wonderfully engineered, real ingenuity in this sutta. And once again, nothing, no real Buddha teachings, no Buddhists in it. But let me and I think at the end of the sutta, the Kalamas could step out of this sutta and step right into the 9th chapter. No, that's a stretch, but it's something to think about. So now let's but one thing that really is interesting. So how the Kalama Sutta really ends, and that ends with the 4 assurances. And once again, that's the asanas in Pali. And what the Buddha seems to be assuring the Kalamas of, and this word can also mean comfort, reassurance, a variety of things, is that they don't have to worry about past and their past act, about what's going to happen to them, and it just made me think that there's a famous story of someone who approaches a Zen master and is asking them about future lives and what will happen and about karma. And the Zen master looks at them and says, "You're asking me about future lives and past lives. don't you have enough problems right here and now? So this is another important teaching. We're really looking to what's happening right now, and we're trying not to label it. We're trying not to get caught in our delusions, impressions, and all of that. So let me read the four assurances. So this is what the Buddha says to the Kalamas. Number one, if there is another world, and if good and bad deeds bear fruit and yield results, it is possible that with the breakup of the body after death, I shall arise in a good destination. I being whoever's hearing this, right? In a heavenly world. So that's the first one. That's a straight, common understanding of karma. Your actions have consequences in a future life, right? We're really talking about what happens after death here. Now, the second one is if there is no other world, right? And the Buddha is not imposing his views, his ideas at all on the Kalamas. He's appealing to their experience and their common sense. So if there is no other world, and if good and bad deeds do not bear fruit and yield results, still, right here in this very life, I live happily, free of enmity and ill will. So that's number two. The Buddha is saying, hey, I don't, does anything happen after death? I don't know. Maybe you're just in a box and you disintegrate, right? What do you know? I mean, what do the Kalamas know? So, but if you act in a wholesome manner, then the benefits are right now in this moment. So the third assurance, suppose evil befalls the evildoer, then as I do not intend evil for anyone, how can suffering afflict me? One who does no evil deed. So here the Buddha is now, he's not even talking about an afterlife. He's really talking about what's sometimes referred to as near karma, right? You punch someone in the nose, chances are they may have an unfavorable reaction, right? But if you do not go around punching people in the nose, you leave their noses alone, then you're not going to get retribution. You're not going to get a reaction from your hostile actions right now, right here. And then the fourth assurance, suppose evil does not befall the evildoer, then right here I see myself purified in both respects, meaning I'm not going to commit evil and no one's coming after me. And even if and I think the implication is even if other people are getting away with murder, almost literally getting away with theft or whatever, that's their business, whatever happens to them, but I'm not going to engage my life in that particular way. Now, it's interesting to compare these four assurances with something called Pascal's wager. And Pascal was a 17th century French philosopher. And he was talking about, this is coming from a Christian viewpoint. And once again, anyone in any tradition really has to deal with this fact of what do you actually know about what is happening, but what's going to happen. I mean, you unless one has some very extraordinary powers, you can't see beyond this life. So then you're tasked with this this problem of, well, what's going to happen. Now, of course, you could ignore the whole thing, but if you're brought up in this an Abrahamic tradition, Christian tradition, it's another thing that you have to think about. So Pascal, as a philosopher, said, you make this wager, and what you're wagering is your life. So if you believe in God, and I can't help when I read this think that you're pretending, but let's say you convince yourself to believe in God, then much like the four assurances, well, let's move to the future. Now we have this scenario where we know what's going to happen, or we're making an assumption. So if there is no afterlife, well, so you've lost a little bit. You didn't go out on a murder spree or a killing spree or sexual misconduct spree. You lived a somewhat sedate life. You didn't have as much fun as you might have, right? Because theoretically, if that's all you care about is the afterlife, then you would have a certain kind of freedom, or a false freedom, one would say, if you just follow whatever impulse comes into your mind. But Pascal wrote that if your wager comes out right, and there really is a God, and then there you are acting as a good person, well, when you go to the teller in the great celestial gambling casino, and you rake in your chips, what you're raking in is heaven. That's what you've achieved, as opposed to raking in hellish chips. So what's kind of interesting is Pascal didn't really consider this life that much. He's really talking about what would happen afterwards. And the Buddha is considering every possibility with the four assurances. And I think that this is something that is really worth further contemplation. And let me see. So I think that really this is a good place for me to stop. I think I've let me just give a quick summary of what I've said. That I've covered what's happening in both the 9th chapter of the Lotus Sutra and the Kalama Sutra, and I showed that what the connection is this this need that we might have for assurance at any level, right? The Kalamas are starting on their path, and the Bodhisattvas are nearing the end of their paths. And if you extrapolate what I'm looking at today, it's something I think that is really applicable to all of us in any kind of endeavor, because then we look really closely and we see, well, what is it? What do we really fear? What are we uncertain about? What can we do to deal with that uncertainty? What do we look like? What does the world look like when that uncertainty is removed? And and the answer is our practice, and we can see the utter dynamics that is shown in comparing these two sutras, right? From people who are not practitioners, know nothing of Buddha Dharma, to those who have been practicing for literally millennia. It comes out. It's alluded to in previous chapters and in this chapter that what we think are our usual story of the Buddha, of being born in this world 2,500 years ago, and being in a palace and leaving home and studying with various masters of the time, and then sitting under the Bodhi tree and achieving highest perfect enlightenment. The Lotus Sutra is going to pick that story apart also. But we can pick apart our own stories and in things, the narratives that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we believe. We can look deeply. So in those 10, the 10 warnings that are given in the Kalama Sutra, and you know, I think I think it's worth reading them again, because as I said, I made my I had my daughter memorize them, and they are something that you know you can go back and look at time and time again. I'm scrolling up. Let's see. So, just so you should not be convinced by unconfirmed reports, by tradition, by hearsay, by scriptures, by logical reasoning, by inferential reasoning, by reflection on superficial appearances, by delighting in opinions and speculation, by the appearance of plausibility, or because you think this person is our teacher. And as I was sort of getting at in my remark just a moment ago, we have this, all of these internal scriptures. We have these internal methods of reasoning, which can be very flawed. And we have these internal teachers, which sometimes are very harsh critics or little inner tyrants that affect our lives, that affect our self-view, our image, affect us in so many ways. And what is so wonderful about the practice is that we can really become aware of all of these things that we are holding on to. And most, I think what we know we're holding on to is sometimes like the tip of an iceberg. And the rest is very submerged, but we can find the whole thing with our practice. And we can, you know, we can take advantage of however you want to look at it. Prophecy, prediction, assurance, all of these things are kind of in our birthright. And, you know, we can really practice contentedly and with great faith and conviction, knowing that the Buddha has our back. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harry, for such a wonderful talk. Anybody has a question? You can unmute yourself.
Oh.
Hi. Yeah, I have a question. So, so may I ask, so what is the other sutra?
I'm sorry, if you could speak a little bit louder.
Could you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, so I'm just wondering, what is the other sutra that you're comparing the Lotus Sutra with? So I don't, you call it the columnist sutra. What is the Chinese name?
Oh, this sutta is called, it's Kalama, the Kalama Sutta.
Oh.
And it's also sometimes known as the discourse at Kesaputta or Kesamutta. It seems to be, and it's you know, it's easily accessible. Just do a Google search and it's in Access to Insight and many other places. Sutra Central. Echo. I see your hand.
Hey. Hi.
Hi.
Hear me? Can you hear me, Harry?
Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you for the wonderful talk. And I was just thinking of the Kalama Sutra. What Buddha was warning us is basically what I perceive it as, take it literally, just take things, without you going through your own, experience. In other words, you listen to something, but then you apply it, you then put that, into action, into practice,
Mm-hmm.
and then become your own understanding. So I think, if I understand correctly, it is that Buddha said you don't take things in those, whatever the what do you say, the 10
Yeah, there are 10 things, yes.
the 10 things on a literal term. But if, like, say, if I really following a teacher that I somehow I have a faith the teacher is a good teacher. Let's say, Shifu say something, right? But if, according to Kalama Sutra, don't even though Shifu is this great practitioner, don't take his words for it. Basically, it's not to say don't listen to a good teacher, but listen to what the good teacher said and apply to what they said, and then to see whether that's useful to you or not. Am I correct?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I agree. It's you have to look at that very carefully, because the thing is, yes, I mean, I would say, to kind of extend the Kalama Sutra, that and there are other things in the Pali Canon, by the way, which talk about vetting a teacher. In other words, finding a teacher that is really good and seeing if they act in a wholesome way. But when you were talking, it reminded me of something Dongshan Liang Jie said about his teacher, Yun Yan. He said, if I agreed with what my teacher said, I would be disrespecting him. Meaning that you have to, as the Kalama Sutta says, you really have to take this, experience it for yourself. That's really the issue. So, short of that, you're like counting other people's cows, as it sometimes says in the sutta. You're not really being true to yourself. But I think it has to be, these things really have to be looked at very carefully and understood.
So in that sense, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I just my printer started by itself, but that's nothing. Go ahead, Echo.
So in that sense, what is assurance really means? That's the question, right?
That is a very good question. Yeah,
well, you are assuring yourself, basically. Once you apply the practice, already, what's the outcome. So the assurance actually is you are assuring yourself, basically.
Yes, I agree. I agree. There's nothing that would really come from the outside, but you're given. I mean, our teachers, our teachers, our Kalyana Mitra, our spiritual friends, are very important in supporting us and helping us get and maintain confidence, right? Because the Buddha path is wonderful, but can be very difficult. Really takes perseverance, and it's very natural for people to get discouraged in their practice and in their understanding. And one of the things, one of the corollary meanings of expedient means, to me, is that if you're really reading a sutra sincerely, then you really do understand it on some level. You know, maybe not like Sherfu would understand it, of course, but there really is something that you can look at, and then you can contemplate. You can go further. But I think the most important thing about assurance is that you continue, you persevere. You know, the Buddha said, "My teaching is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good at the end." And so you want to go from the beginning right through to the end.